Good morning, everyone. We are going to be talking about 1 Samuel 18. We just talked about David and Goliath, and now we are starting to hear about David and his eventual, um, essentially, turn to power. What happens after the story of David and Goliath is we get this change in character from Saul, um, or maybe not necessarily a change in character, but he becomes more crafty. He starts to recognize and sort of become worried of David. But before that happens, we should sort of get the idea of that Jonathan and David become these kindred brothers that have an incredible relationship with each other. The passage opens up with right after David's done talking with Saul about about what happened with Goliath. Jonathan and David become one in spirit. They become as close as two friends can ever be. And Jonathan essentially takes David as his brother and welcomes him into the family. Now, because of David's victory with Goliath, he sort of is put into a position of authority within the army, and he very quickly begins to increase in rank. So David initially begins as a lower person within the army, but after this becomes more and more high-ranking, and over time becomes a pretty significant participant in Saul's army. Um, and over the time that he has been constantly becoming more and more popular, we hear that people are chanting about David and how he has slain tens of thousands while Saul has only slain thousands, and this gives Saul a really bad taste in his mouth. Meaning that Saul is not happy with it, and you can sort of see the inner workings of jealousy begin to manifest itself. If you just think about this, just before Saul didn't really know who David was. David was just some sort of shepherd. And even though the plan's been sort of orchestrated and manifested by God already with Samuel anointing David, Saul doesn't really understand this, and other people don't really understand. But David begins to become more and more powerful and increase in influence in Israel. Now, this has upset Saul to a pretty significant level. And so one day, when this is all happening, David's still spending time with Saul, and he still plays the lyre in Saul's palace. And one time when Saul is very upset, he ends up he ends up trying to essentially throw a spear at David and kill him. David's able to avoid it, but this isn't the first time that Saul tries to kill David. And Saul goes about this task in a whole bunch of different ways. His initial response or initial idea was to kill David with himself, but then he becomes more and more crafty, and he starts thinking to himself, well, maybe I'm not going to kill David, but maybe I'll have the Philistines kill David. So he actually ends up sending David to distant places, giving him very, very hard tasks to complete. And his goal is for the Philistines to die. Now, what's interesting is later on in David's life, he's going to do the exact same thing to Bathsheba's husband, Uriah the Hittite. But this sort of comes out from Saul having this initial idea where he has David go to against the Philistines, and it's constantly fighting more and more Philistines, and every single time David's still being victorious. And this is not really pleasing to Saul. This is not what his plan is right now. And no matter what he does, David always comes out with victory and ends up being successful. So Saul's next decision is saying, well, what I'll have happen now actually is I'll have David marry into my family. And that way I have some element of control, but also I can put him in risky situations and I can sort of snare his heart and these different ideas. And so Saul says, well, what I'll do is I'll have him marry my daughter. And the first situation doesn't really work out. David is quite reluctant to become this king's son. Not out of fear of Saul, but more that he is thinking himself lower than Saul, or understanding that he is not to be, he's a man of humble beginnings. He describes himself as, who am I? I'm a poor man from a poor family. Like, why would I be the person that marries the king's daughter? So that plan sort of goes aside, but eventually David does eventually marry one of Saul's daughters. Her name's Michal. And this comes about in the same situation where Saul puts an offer out to David and says, listen, you can marry my daughter, but you have to first bring me 100 foreskins of Philistines. And that's quite the feat if you were to try to accomplish that yourself. And David goes out and actually collects 200 foreskins. So he goes above and beyond, and he is willing to risk his life for this love that he has for Michal. Um, but over the course of this story, David is put in a more and more risky situation, but he always comes out on top. And we can attribute that to two things. The first, the fact that David is extremely good at fighting, and he's a very wise strategist, very excellent at leading armies and understanding exactly what he needs to do. But also, the fact that God has an ultimate plan for him. This sort of comes back to what happened in with the story of Goliath too. David was against all odds. He wasn't in a favorable position, but he understands that God has his back and that God is protecting him, and we can see him accomplish all these things. Now, this is all leading to the fact of what's going to happen in the future, which is David's role in establishing Israel as a mighty nation, and eventually for Solomon to show up and to build the temple. And we're starting to see these images or these ideas of David sort of being this Christ-like figure almost. We're heard about later on that Jesus is identified or recognized as sort of a David-like character in the Bible. And that's sort of what's happening here. David is constantly overcoming odds, and every single time he's being met with more and more success. And this is not pleasing to Saul, and Saul's now in opposition with David. I know it's a short lesson, but this was a summary of 1 Samuel 18. I hope it was helpful, and have a great day.